Welcome to the webinar. I'm Kevin McKenzie, the head of product marketing at Prodigal, and today we're going to explore the secret to identifying and managing consumer complaints. So we have a great panel with us today who I'll introduce very shortly, but before that, I'll just take you through the brief agenda here. So we're going to touch on why complaints are such a big concern, complaint management best practices, and also how to overcome some of the biggest challenges in that process. So with that, I'd like to welcome our first panelist, and that's Lee Brockett. He is the CEO of Cascade 365, has over 19 years of C-level experience in tech, fund management, specialty finance, and accounts receivable management. And looking at the Cascade 365 family of companies, they specialize in accounts receivable liquidity solutions for healthcare and consumer finance companies. Would you like to add anything else about yourself or Cascade 365?
I think that pretty well covers it. Thank you for having me today, Kevin and Scott and the Prodigal team.
Great. It's nice to have you with us today. And we also have Anand Joshi with us. He's an industry expert and also the former VP of Global Collections at American Express. While there, he built and led a team of over 250 professionals managing collections operational risk worldwide. And that was overseeing a network of more than 50 agencies across 80 global locations. And welcome to the webinar. Would you like to share anything about yourself or your background?
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate the introduction as well as having me on the webinar. Well, actually, this covers quite well. I think just to be absolutely clear, I ran the collection business at Amex, and then, so of course, along with the P&L of the collection business, operational risk was a big component of it. And within operational risk, I would say compliance was a big part of it. So I think I would say this is pretty relevant.
Yes, thank you. And also our third speaker today is Scott Hamilton. So he's our bank strategy leader here at Prodigal, more than 30 years of experience in guiding consumer lending operations transformations, and that's across companies like GE Capital, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Capital One. Scott, would you like to add anything about your background?
No, just happy to be here. Happy to be with Prodigal. I have a background in transformation at some of the larger banks, and across a lot of those came in contact with complaints and the need for this sort of technology. So I'm excited to be here and talk about what's next.
Perfect. All right. And before we start to dig into things like best practices and recommendations, Scott, would you like to help us set the stage by just summing up why are complaints such a big concern?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I worked for a long time and still do, trying to optimize businesses, banks, and it's amazing how often complaints comes to the front line in terms of whether you're trying to drive costs, drive down risk, regulatory issues, or drive up revenues. And it's one of the only things that everybody cares a lot about. However, it's probably tied for first in terms of one of the toughest things to nail down and define and aggregate and act on. So it's sort of the largest opportunity, but oftentimes the toughest problem to solve. So if we can make any progress, then we all win.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And thinking about that being such a big concern, is it normally, from your perspective, in regards to things like compliance and regulations? Is it more customer experience, both equally important, or any thoughts you could share on that?
I think that, at least from my background, the driving catalyst seems to be the strongest from a regulatory standpoint. But very quickly, that's sort of the forcing mechanism. But very quickly, when you dive into the drivers and the root causes, the amount of expense drag that they have on the organization, and probably tied for second or close third is the revenue lost by dissatisfied customers or fees that are being given back. But the forcing mechanism typically is in the regulatory quality space.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense there. All right. Yeah, thank you for that intro and kicking us off. So, without further ado, we'll just jump right into exploring some of the best practices around managing complaints. So, what does that process look like? And to start us off on this topic, let's go to you, Lee. So, from your point of view, what have you found works best when it comes to managing complaints, and what does that process look like for you? Anything you want to share about that?
Absolutely. At Cascade, we have a robust process for both fielding complaints, the mediums in which we can have complaints reported to us, either from the outside, third-party regulatory agencies, the CFPB, or the Better Business Bureau. We also have a direct channel with all the vendors that we use, in that we outsource quite a bit of business to vendors. So we have our own process and our own platform for identifying, resolving, and then acting upon complaints.
Sure.
So we're working with the vendors to make sure that if there is an issue, that we avoid it in the future.
Definitely. And from your perspective, have you found that that process has been complex, or at this point, do you feel like you have it down where it's solved, ready to go, or do you have to constantly find that you're evolving and tweaking it and adjusting it over time, or what have you seen from your points of view?
Outside of bright line compliance with the laws that pertain to our business, the beauty of complaints to me is that it's just so common sense. You have to listen to people. If you don't listen to people and heed their word and investigate if they do have a complaint, then those complaints escalate, or they even turn into litigation. So the baseline for managing complaints, I think, is kind of common sense. Conceptually very easy, logistically more difficult, in short.
Sure.
So that's dealing with all the systems and technology and the hub and spoke fashion in which the way Cascade works is that we'll outsource accounts to collection agencies, and then we'll manage the compliance risk and throughput with our partners. So that's just that one-to-many structure is logistically hard to manage on occasion.
Definitely. I could see that. Okay. Yes, and now looking for a second to you, Anand, from your background, what have you seen as some of the best practices for managing complaints and how to run that process successfully? Thinking about everything from identifying, capturing, resolution, escalations if necessary. What have you seen from your experience?
Sure. So I think that's a pretty important question. And actually, my perspective is built upon my experience,
Sure.
which can be representative of a large lender who have multiple sources from where the complaints might come in. Right? It's not just one source. So I would say the first and foremost, identifying a complaint is very critical. What is a complaint? Right? So you need to have a well-defined parameters set up in your system. And when I say system, meaning the entire human technology system, whereby the interaction with the consumers happen, so that you can identify the complaint clearly that this is a complaint. And you have to have very clear understanding about what it should be, especially when you are dealing with large number of people and different entities or collection agencies or law firms simultaneously. You want to make sure everybody has a common understanding of it. Typically, at the point of first interaction, we would cast a wider net, meaning we would be a bit more, how should I say, generous about saying that this is a complaint versus it's not.
Mhm.
Because you can always capture it with a wider net and then sort of then narrow it down. So you'll have to invest some resources to narrowing it down. Of course, that just generate good return, because if you can say 30% of my complaints are not really complaints, that brings down the number of you need to resolve, right?
Sure.
So how do we narrow it down? That needs to be defined well as well. And as Scott also mentioned, it is a people-intensive kind of operation, because right now most of the players, they have a large human intervention in the entire process. So they are not automated to the degree they could be. But with that, I mean, they have invested a lot of resources and a lot of money and a lot of time into the entire process. So, how do I manage that well? People management, training of people, make sure the people understand what to capture as a complaint and what to sort of escalate further as a complaint. Right? And there are a
Sure.
large number of people here, so well-trained agents workforce is very important from a best practice standpoint in this particular space, right? And then I would say also we used to have one centralized system where all complaints are captured and stored and analyzed, because that actually gives you a pretty good points with the regulators as well. So we
Yes.
would typically have that. So even if you are sourcing from multiple ways and multiple angles, we would house it. So somebody, whoever detects a complaint, they go and houses that complaint in that system. And debt collection actually is a big chunk of it. I mean, we always had the debt largest source of complaints. Of course, large lenders have other complaints as well coming in.
Sure.
But debt collection always sort of top the list. And I think even if you ask CFPB, probably they say the same thing, that
Yeah.
the debt collection tops the list on their side as well. So from a best practice standpoint, how to run this process and function very smoothly is absolutely critical. That's sort of my perspective on this.
Yes. You brought up the point about people versus software versus technology. So briefly, Lee, from your perspective, do you find it is mostly a training of employees that helps with complaints? Is it process management? Is it technology, a combination of all three where those intersect, or any thoughts about that?
You can't replace the human elements, but definitely the industry and I think the world is evolving towards leading with technology and really having technology do most of the heavy lifting, and then have humans go in and interpret, strategize, and perform QA on the back end technology. So we know whether it's complaints that we're gleaning through call reviews, or if they're being reported to us directly by our collection agencies that we work with. We have a pretty robust technology platform that we use as the primary staging ground. And then we have a great team that are obviously very skilled and trained in our business, that cull through and we'll narrow the results and really hone in on what needs to be fixed and addressed.
Yeah, that's
So
perfect.
it's all the above, right?
Yes,
You
definitely.
got to have the bots, got to have the humans.
Yeah, one doesn't work well without the other. Makes a lot of sense to me. Great. Thanks for your take on that. And now we'll just pivot slightly. So we talked a little bit about the process and how that process should work and what it looks like when it's working well. So now we can talk about some of the biggest challenges you've encountered. And maybe to start us off on this, how about Lee? Have you found that is there any part of the process that is particularly tricky? Is it around perhaps things like defining what is a complaint, what isn't? Is it around that human training angle, or anything you've run into that you've overcome but was once a challenge for you?
Yeah, I think definitely deciding what is and is not a complaint is crucial, as was previously mentioned. I mean, you can get a lot of false positives and really skew your results when you're looking at compliance and complaints. If you are funneling requests for validation or just straight disputes with no complaint attached to it, if you're funneling those into the complaints category. So we've seen that before. We've seen our numbers go up and be an issue, but then we'll dive into it and really understand that the bulk of what we're seeing aren't actual true complaints. They're not an allegation of wrongdoing or mistreatments. And then capturing and categorizing the complaints. I mean, really, again, getting back to technology. That's really mostly technology driven. And then the backdraft of working with agents and outsource vendors and addressing any issues that could be endemic to their collection efforts. That's primarily human driven. with training and disciplinary actions if we need to. But 9 times out of 10, we're not experiencing any gross abuse from a complaint or compliance standpoint. It may just be having to run through the fundamentals again, or work with an agent on something very, very basic that is a bright line compliance issue. So it's the biggest thing for us really is the complexity of our hub and spoke structure, and that we're outsourcing AR to a good number of collection agencies. And of course, you can't outsource or offset your risk. So we have to make sure that we're on top of it. So really, our biggest concern and the biggest challenge we face is just the logistics of overseeing in a one-to-many fashion all of these consumer and patient contacts.
Got it. Yeah, I could definitely understand that. And now, similar question for you, Anand. So based on your experience and what you've seen in the space, what typically are the biggest challenges when somebody's trying to create a plan to tackle this that they have to encounter and figure out a way around?
Yeah, I mean, again, challenges are actually, I would say, multiple fold. But I would say they begin with very large volumes of complaints coming in. And especially, again, I'm speaking from a large mega lender perspective.
Sure.
We would have thousands and thousands of complaints a month, right? And again, coming from multiple sources. So how do you handle these large volumes? That's a pretty big challenge with accuracy and with precision, which is not easy, right? Secondly, I would say even complexity of it, meaning sometimes people complain directly. Hey, you call me too many times, or you send me too many letters or emails or blah, 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 blah. Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes the complaints are indirect, meaning after listening to the discussion or the letter, reading the letter for 5 minutes, you realize there's a complaint in there somewhere. And again, so that figuring that out, it's a complex process. I think that's where the challenges come in many times for us. So that's why the training becomes very, very important, that people understand what is a complaint. If it's a direct complaint, much easier to figure out. If it's an indirect complaint, and by the way, fair share of volume comes as an indirect complaint, right? So figuring that out is a challenge. Training the agents to make sure they are well versed with how to categorize or understand something as a complaint. I would say, again, same goes for the investigative and the resolution teams as well. So again, it's multiple fold at multiple stages. It's a complex process. How do we follow through in making sure that because the regulators are not going to be happy just you identify the complaint. They have to make sure you not only identify it, capture it, catalog it, resolve it, and get back to the customer on what actually happened. So that is very important. Also, the centralization of the system, right? It's not easy also, especially if you're getting from multiple sources, as we did, and many of the lenders and many of the agencies do as well. So keeping all these things together itself becomes challenging. As Scott mentioned, it is resource intensive, it is costly. So is there a way to sort of optimize your process and lower cost, improve accuracy, and improve the overall effectiveness of the process? That I would say are the biggest challenges here.
Yes, yeah. It's a great point to have brought up there. And also, Scott, so while we have you here on this topic, do you have any thoughts around this, the biggest challenges in this process and how people could maybe start to think about overcoming those?
Yeah, from an example, I think in general, there are many solutions and lots of people, once you identify the complaint and it's fairly clean and aggregated to Anand's point, researching root cause and fixing it and getting back to the customer, I think people generally get that. And it's slow and labor intensive and important, but I think it's sort of a known issue and a problem and a process that people have addressed. It's really, in my experience, it's the front half of the process. It's identifying the complaints across multiple channels and aggregating them in a way to yield clean data so that you can then go after the tallest bar and issue quickly. So that's generally where most of the large banks have received either MRAs or consent orders. It's because of the difficulty in identifying and capturing and aggregating all the needed complaints. That's the challenge, and where in some cases they've thrown technology at, but the false positives and negatives sort of accuracy rate has been a super big challenge. Some banks are actually ripping that out because of the accuracy and are going exclusively dependent on the agents or those in the branches or front line to self-declare, and that has different challenges and associated with it. But that's where I see most banks and firms wrestling and dealing with it.
That's interesting. And with that, that probably helps us segue into our next topic here, just taking a look at what is Prodigal doing to try to help with this complex problem. And would you mind maybe shedding a little light on that and walking us through what we're working on?
Sure. Many of the larger firms are realizing that for all the above reasons, asking a distributed network or thousands of agents to form judgment opinions on every interaction they have or every letter they read or text they read as to whether there was a complaint in there. And they are also actually asking those frontline agents to identify, but to de-escalate and remediate in the moment. And that makes for an even tougher job out there on the front line. So those specific problems, the front end of identification, de-escalation, documentation, generating accurate data, is actually squarely in what Prodigal's best at. I think Lee referenced a few points that where we can help. We use highly trained models that those agents have already taught to take the in-the-moment judgment off the table and help to automate the identification, the holding the hands of the agent in the moment to de-escalate or remediate, automate some of the note capture for those that are familiar with what we do is critical for the complaint thread. And then lastly, some of the insights and QA activity on the back end. So it's really taking our bread and butter solutions, but putting a complaints filter on the front of it in order to help agents in the moment document more efficiently and then QA validate and report on the back end. So it's an exciting space.
Definitely. All right. And looking here, have a couple questions that we can jump into here. One of them, so talking about best practices, I'm curious if anybody has thoughts on the flip side, maybe anything that you've seen people in the space try to do that just didn't work so well and could maybe be sort of a cautionary tale for others to prevent them from making a mistake you saw someone else make, or also just something perhaps that was proposed to you that you thought this doesn't sound like a great idea. And I wonder, Lee, do you have any thoughts around that? And if not, that's fine. But I was curious, anything that sort of is not a best practice when it comes to the whole thing around managing complaints and sorting out that complexity?
I think not having alignment or unity with the operations team, the people actually performing the collections and management overseeing the staff. I think having strong incentives for compliance, contests. Obviously, you have a hammer as well, right? As far as like disciplinary action or walking someone out the door, but having carrots along the way and just good structural alignment between the compliance and operations sides of the business. So you're not having a culture of non-compliance or a culture that drives complaints in the first place. I'd also say, resolving any compliance or complaint issues on the floor at the manager level, and not having technology or a compliance team that sit on top of the process or beside the process. So again, misalignment between operations and the collections revenue producing team and the compliance team. They all have to work in unison and lockstep, and also leaving it to just a collection manager to resolve all the complaints and track all the complaints. I think that's a not a good way of doing things in 2023.
That makes sense. And Anand, maybe in about the last 2 minutes, do you have thoughts around that? Anything that is not a best practice or something from your point of view that you would stay away from?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, also we discussed identifying complaints accurately when I say is, I would say with a little bit of a liberal bend to it is important. If you leave that to the operations, typically it doesn't come back with a good result. I would say leave that with the compliance experts who are actually interfacing with, at times, regulators as well. So I think they should become the arbitrator on designing what the complaint is. So that's sort of my perspective on this. So don't let the people who are on the floor design or decide what a complaint is. That has to come from somewhere else, especially from a legal compliance standpoint.
Yeah, that is a great point there. All right, so with that, that's half hour, like it always does, pretty much flew by. We're pretty much at the end. But before we go, I wanted to thank everybody for taking your time to join us. So thank you, Lee. Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Scott, for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.
Cheers.